We are continuing our read of A Disease of Horror. This week, we are doing K for Killing Joke. I'm going to go ahead and preface this with, I'm sorry for any French that I am about to butcher. So, K for Killing Joke. At its best, theatrical horror can be overwhelmingly intense. Think of Greek tragedy and Shakespeare. But for sheer spectacle, you can't beat the French theater du grand guignol. Grand guignol is the term that has entered our language to describe the most gruesome events. But was there anything quite so harrowing as the events enacted on a small stage in Paris almost 100 years ago? The Grand Guignol was opened on 13 April 1897 by Oscar Metinier, says historian Agnes Piron. He was a very strange character. He was a secretary to a police commissioner. One of his duties was to accompany a condemned man to his death. He was not a literary man or a poet. He was a man of the flesh, suffering flesh that was going to die. For 65 years, various troupes of actors titillated Parisian audiences with one-act performances of murder, mayhem, and revenge. Every night on stage, they performed stabbings, mutilations, beheadings, gougings, tortures, and dismemberments in gloriously graphic detail. The Grand Guignol is more sophisticated than it first appears, says Perron. Its specialty was horror, terror, and blood. What is original is that there was no monsters. Nothing was obvious as that. What it explored was not ancient fears, but those of today. Characters such as the madman, the condemned man, ordinary people you might meet on the street, the seemingly normal person who goes off the rails. The Théâtre des Grands Guignols was situated 20 Rue Chaptal in Pigalle, a somewhat sleazy part of Montmartre. The building had once been a convent, which was destroyed during the French Revolution, and only the chapel remained. The wooden Gothic auditorium, consisting of a ground floor and balcony, could accommodate almost 300 people when full. When you arrived in the Rue Chaptal, it was dark, recalls audience member Peche, who, as a young girl in the late 1950s and early 60s, would accompany her family to the Grand Guignol. It felt as if Paris life had been left far behind. I was a bit scared and checked to see if anyone was following me. Suddenly, you were in this cobblestoned alleyway, explains actor and director Robert Hossein, who worked at the Grand Guignol during the 1950s. A mysterious alleyway. If you didn't know the area and the street, you'd miss it. At the end of the street, there was this theater and an old wooden chapel. Inside, there was a certain atmosphere and smell, continues Petch. Being an old chapel, maybe the smell was incense or maybe wax, I don't know. It felt like plunging into a tomb, but the point was it created a spooky atmosphere. I was a young actor in this theater, says Hossein. I was bewitched by the atmosphere. It was as if the religious fervor brought devil worshippers to the Grand Guignol. The stage manager always shouted for more blood. The rain sometimes leaked through the roof. The audience thought it was raining blood. And then for an aside, Grand Guignol, dramatic entertainment in which short, sensational, or horrific pieces are played successively, name of the theater in Paris, the concise Oxford Dictionary. And then we've got some pictures. Among the many famous authors and playwrights whose work was adapted for the stage of the Grand Guignol were James Hadley Chase, Henry George Closet, Charles Dickens, Théophile Gautier, Rudyard Kipling, Gaston Leroux, Guy de Maupassant, Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Robert Reinhardt, Robert Louis Stevenson, Mark Twain, and Émile Zola, to name only a few. One of the more memorable plays performed there was titled On the Telephone, or Au Téléphone, by Charles Foley and André Delorde. Some of the plays were masterpieces, enthuses Hossein. Extraordinary theater, like the one about the man on the telephone. He's talking to his wife. She tells him that the burglars have broken in and are going to kill her. She's telling him over the phone, but there's nothing he can do, so the phone becomes an instrument for horror. The Grand Guignol was based on the ideas of naturalism, explains Agnes Perron, referring to the theatrical movement of the late 1880s, inspired by the French novelist Émile Zola. If meat was needed in a scene, real meat was used on stage, so real objects, everyday objects, without being transformed from normal everyday use, were transposed to the stage, and it was this that was so scandalous at the time. I often had my eyes poked out, says actor André Chanu. I was regularly strangled. That's how I spent my time at the Grand Guignol, much to my pleasure and everyone else's pain. After Metenier mysteriously disappeared in 1889, the theater continued to thrive under various owners and managers, and the Grand Duchesnal progressed from pantomimes and morality plays to much more gruesome fare. By 1910, it was the best-known tourist attraction in Paris. I worked at the Grand Duchesnal from 1933, remembers actress Mado Marie, and it was a fairy tale come true. It was the happiest time of my life because that is where I started. I was only 17. The Grand Duchesnal at that time was a real classic. People came from all over. They'd go to the Opera, Comédie Française, but also to the Grand Duchesnal. It was a must. There was this scene. It was horrible. A man was gasping for air, not able to speak. He was held down. His eyes had gouged out, blood pouring. Horrible. Of course, blood was the most important of all special effects, agrees Agnes Perron. Grand Duchesnal was about horror, but also about the eroticism which underpinned horror. Don't forget that this theater was in a desecrated church. Therefore, what pleasure to indulge in the forbidden and live out the impossible. At the back of the theater were discreet boxes fronted by wire mesh walls marin, where certain members of the audience would go as an alternative to a hotel room. It was no surprise to me that some got a certain physical pleasure out of watching horror and would perhaps like to share it. The cleaning ladies would find traces of sexual pleasure from the audience, Agnes Perron continues. Ejaculating, yes. Vomiting, no. You can't do it all at once. You could see these boxes from the stage, laughs actor Bernard Charlin, and once I shouted, "You enjoy yourselves in there." So here's side. Tucked away in corner of Paris's Rue Chaptal, cobblestone nook at the edge of Montmartre, and is a quaint little Gothic chapel. Inside, carved cherubs and 2 7-foot angels smile down from the black raftered vault at a nightly round of vile murders, manglings, and assorted acts of torturing, fang-bearing, acid-throwing. The one-time chapel is now a Le Theatre des Grands Junaux, the theater of the big puppets, the greatest horror show on earth. Time, 10 March 1947. With almost half a century of unbroken history behind it, the world-famous institution was given the French language the phrase "C'est du grand journal" to denote any theatrical piece performed anywhere that is emotionally terrifying. Boris Karloff. And then we got some pictures. I'm going to do the asides for this one first. Terror movies are merely the modern progression from that old standby of the live theater, Grand Junot. Peter Cushing. The Grand Junot is more than a theater. It is a tradition and institution like the Eiffel Tower, the Foy Bergère, and Maxims. From Fading Horrors of the Grand Junot, the New York Times Magazine, 17 March 1957. And we've got some pictures and a list called Grand Junot in the Movies. One of the undisputed stars of the Theatre du Grand Junot was an actress named Maxef, who the newspapers of the day dubbed as the High Priestess of the Temple of Horror. During her career, she is said to have been murdered more than 10,000 times in over 60 different ways, raped more than 3,000 times, and cried help nearly 1,000 times. Perhaps her worst fate was when she was cut up into 93 pieces, then glued back together again. The Theatre du Grand Junot reached its peak of popularity during the 1920s, but by the end of the following decade, its reputation started to wane as the real-life horrors of Adolf Hitler began to engulf the world. Although Field Marshal Hermann Göring of the Luftwaffe was a regular patron during the early 40s, the occupying Nazi forces condemned the Grand Junot as Entarrte Kunst, degenerate art. According to historian Agnes Perron, the fact that the Grand Junot was frequented by the Nazis contributed to its downfall, no doubt about it. It was part of the tourist trail at the end of the 30s. The Nazis couldn't avoid coming across it. The Grand Junot never recovered after the Second World War. It was supposed to show the worst kind of horror, but the war itself was that kind of horror. There were a lot of Germans in the audience, agrees actor Chanou. They had nothing like it back home, neither did the Americans who followed. They had nothing which resembled the Grand Junot, which is why they were so keen on it. On several occasions, the German officers came backstage to offer their compliments after the show without realizing I was in the resistance. However, the Grand Junot could not hope to compete with the horrors of the modern world, and the theater limped on as a tourist attraction, becoming increasingly a parody of its finest achievements. It finally closed its doors the last time in 1962. The building still stands, now operating as a theater school. This specialized form of theater no longer exists, laments Agnes Perron. During its existence, the Grand Junot inspired imitators of Rome, London, starring Sybil and Russell Thorndike in New York, and it has arguably influenced everything from the expressionist movement of the silent German cinema to the gore films of Herschel Gordon Lewis and others. Over the years, there have been several efforts to revive the Grand Guignol in America, most notably with the productions of the About Face Theater Company in New York City. Horror writers involved with more recent attempt included Robert Bloch and David J. Shaw. Even today, its legacy is still with us. And then the aside is, the Grand Guignol is the stage what Edgar Allan Poe is to the short story. From Fading Horrors of the Grand Guignol, New York Times Magazine, 17 March 1957. We leave it to others to say whether such scenes ought to belong in the art of the theater, but it may be said that Delord and Binet have traveled a long way from the Greeks who would not allow any scene of violence on their stage, and who made them faithful messenger recount things too horrible to be seen. New York Times, 23 October, 1923. And then we have our last poster. And that is K for Killing Joke. There's a lot to be said about it. Sorry, first of all, for my terrible French. It has always been awful, no matter how many times I have attempted to not be terrible at it. But the first time I heard about it is because I was watching a YouTube video about blood, actually. That was several years ago because I was attempting to make my own blood. Never perfected that. I have someone else who makes beautiful, amazing, perfect blood. But it was really, really educational that apparently what blood we use now, like the corn syrup style, was perfected during those theater runs. And also, if anybody's a fan of James Bond, the film Dead Silence is actually an homage, supposed to be an homage to the style of theater, which is pretty cool. Yeah. Sorry, I'm also like, my brain goes in 30 million directions. So I guess I will keep talking, which is the last thing I wanted to say was when we were talking about the Nazis basically killing the theater. I was thinking about the film Cabaret and about how like it probably did kill their theater as well, because when you get to the end, you know, even though they were just working and they were still just trying to work and still trying to entertain, you get to the end and it's a bar full of Nazis, and it's really, really heartbreaking and terrifying, because even though we've been through this whole story, it doesn't matter. You're still having to be quiet and just perform. Although it is still a really, really powerful message, because as when you are in the performing arts, you know, any sort of dancer, magician, singers, any sort of performing art, mimes even. I don't know why my brain just blanked out into literally every other venue of performing arts, but you have to be dedicated to your craft, and you have to just keep on going. Although I am going to leave with an Alejandro Jodorowsky, referencing back to Alejandro Jodorowsky, when he said that he thinks that artists are the jesters of society, because in reality, part of your job as an artist is to be the distraction. And hopefully, if you can get some form of message through your art, then you're doing a pretty good job. Anyway, that was K for Killing Joke. Next week, we have L for Lynch Mob. So thank you for reading with me. Thank you for listening to my rambles. And I will see you next week. Bye.